Irish, her father entirely Irish. In fact, his parents were immigrants. So she knew that her grandparents were immigrants. She knew that, she was kind of trying to get a little bit further back, up, particularly on his side. And so, like many people who are faced with a surprise when they do DNA testing, she went in assuming she knew what she was going to find. And the test was still in beta, which meant that she wasn't sure just how reliable the results are going to be. So when she spits into a vial, she gets back the results and she is floored and at first somewhat dismissive, because what it tells her is that she is not entirely this, mix of British Isles, primarily Irish, that she's expecting. Instead, it is telling her that her pie chart is basically split in half, that half of it is this mix of British Isles and mostly Irish that she's expecting. And the other half is a mix of ancestry that she would later come to understand is associated with Ashkenazi Jews, which is Jews from Eastern and Central Europe who have a very distinct genetic signature that looks different from someone who's Irish. And so at first she basically, assumes that Ancestry has messed up. Their test is still not ready for prime time. She emails them and tells them so. And then she also, though, is, kind of curious and wants to see, can she confirm that they've messed up? And among the folks she talks to is her sister, and her sister is one of the folks on this call. They decide that they're going to do another test, and they're going to test through 23andMe, and they're going to basically investigate what the story is. So why is Alice's story interesting? Because the obvious explanations for her mystery are not what winds up being the explanations for her mystery. Okay, so anyone here who's worked with people who have an unexpected DNA result knows, or if you've had one yourself, you may know that if you got half your ancestry is not what you expected, the most likely explanation is that you are the product of an NPE, right? Non-paternity event or not parent expected. Sometimes it's called misattributed parentage. And that is one of the most common types of DNA surprises that we see. Not that it is a common outcome overall, right? Most people are not finding this out, but there's a significant minority of people who are finding out something they didn't expect about their own genetic origins or their own immediate families. And NPEs are right up there, probably, along with discovery of a half sibling you didn't previously know about. Those are the top two from what I've seen. So, but it turns out that Alice is not the product of an NPE. It turns out that she is not adopted, which is another theory that she explores. She is not donor conceived, which would also be a likely explanation. And her whole family winds up testing. Her parents are no longer alive, but all 7 Collins siblings test. They come from a large Irish Catholic family, so there's 7 of them. They all test, and they all share this genetic ancestry, which is half Jewish. And the last theory that they kind of explore to explain their unexpected ancestry is that they might have some sort of hidden genetic ancestry, right? And so you definitely hear stories about families who, for instance, convert from Judaism to another religion and hide that or forget. There's a kind of intentional forgetting, or they don't convert, but there's a kind of assimilation and erasure of that religious and ethnic affiliation. Also in the US, and this is not just within that one group, but for instance, there are African Americans who are light-skinned and they choose to pass as white to escape rampant discrimination. And then there may be a process of intentional or unintentional intergenerational forgetting or erasure. And so that's the sort of last theory that they investigate, and that turns out not to be the explanation. And the explanation turns out to be basically a 100-year-old mystery. I won't say what it is because it's worth reading it and seeing for yourself. But it's a 100-year-old mystery that allowed me then to go back and do some historical research into the relevant context for it, which I found absolutely fascinating. And the story itself has so many twists and turns that so each time they explore a different theory, I can then go and show you what it looks like from the perspective of multiple people to discover that you are the product of an NPE, or that you are adopted and nobody told you when you found out via test, or that you're donor conceived and you have perhaps many siblings. I write about a family with 24 children. 22 of them are products of donation, sperm donation, or assisted conception. And I also write about the story of a man named Rosario, who is he's kind of fits into that fourth bucket that I was describing of hidden genetic ancestry. He is African American. He doesn't know it. He is told by his mother that he is Sicilian because she's trying to protect him from the discrimination she felt growing up as a biracial child in the middle of the 20th century. And so she tells him he is Sicilian, and he finds out through a combination of DNA and genealogy that in fact his grandfather was Black. And it totally reorients his view of the world. And I mean, one thing I'll say is that for Alice and her family and everyone I've interviewed, these revelations about finding out that your understanding of yourself and your place on this earth is different than you thought, these are big things, right? There's a tendency sometimes for people who haven't experienced this to say, what's the big deal? It's the biggest deal in the world. It really reorients your sense of identity and your understanding of who you are. It makes you rewrite your personal narrative. It's kind of like if you had a story of your life and you have a beginning and a middle, it's like changing the beginning somehow changes everything else, right? Your once upon a time changes. And then every other memory and every other understanding of yourself and your place in your family kind of gets reworked through the lens of this new information. So these are huge kind of stories. And Alice's story is so great because in addition to the fact that I got to spend time with her, and I was delighted to kind of give readers the opportunity to spend time with her. She's smart and she's funny and she has this great analytical brain, and she winds up like doing an enormous amount of genetic genealogy work, and she's really fascinating. And I loved kind of writing about all her databases and she basically wound up building a database of her own DNA and those of all 6 of her siblings and all of their genetic cousins who at the time numbered in the thousands, and all of those overlapping genetic segments which numbered in the hundreds of thousands. It's the hugest job in the world, and she spends 2.5 years of full-time work doing this.
Wow. I can't imagine doing that. I've not done that. You've said that one of the realities of technological advances is that their true impact is hard to anticipate. Is that the case with home DNA testing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I got to do for the book is travel to some of the places in the US where genealogy and DNA have kind of, grown up, right? So I got to see the Ancestry's headquarters. I got to go to the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. And I got to go down to Texas and interview Bennett Greenspan. Bennett Greenspan is the founder of Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest DNA testing company, recreational DNA testing company for ancestry purposes in the US. And it was founded exactly 20 years ago. And, Bennett is someone who is a genealogist and believed himself to be creating a product that was just for people like him. And in the first 10 years of the industry, you see that the only people who are buying these tests, and there's not that many, are genealogists like him, right? Which makes sense because at the time the tests are kind of expensive, right? A few $100s. It's again only telling you about your ancient origins because this is before autosomal comes on the scene. And so it's really a narrow slice of America that's interested in this. And then you see when autosomal comes in the scene, and especially when ancestry gets into the game. And ancestry is just the combination, the power and the combination of the subscription archives put together with the DNA testing. That's kind of like a brilliant insight to put those two things together. And Ancestry also has a lot of money, and they spend a lot of money on advertising. And so what happens is that this form of what's considered entertainment, which is purchasing a DNA test, moves out of the realm of being just for serious genealogists. Of course, it remains very interesting for them. but it moves into the realm of the casual consumer, people like me, right? People who weren't going to buy a gift until it became almost like inevitable, or weren't going to buy a kit until it became inevitable, or they got it as a gift, which is how I got my first kit. And it becomes the gift that you give for the holidays because there's a Thanksgiving sale or, a holiday sale. It becomes the thing that you get for the person in your life who already has everything, right? So then it becomes people testing who in some cases don't even know what they're getting, right? They don't sometimes even know that they're getting lists of genetic relatives. They're just expecting that pie chart because those ads for that pie chart are so compelling. They don't even realize they're going to see genetic relatives. I interviewed a guy who he was a sperm donor back in the 1970s, and now he knows he has 22 children from that, as well as the 2 children that he raised, so 24 biological children. And he was gifted the test from the daughters that he raised, and he took the test despite the fact that he knew he'd been a sperm donor in the 1970s, never realizing that he was going to get to see all the children that he had helped conceive, because he didn't even know that you get lists of genetic relatives when you take an ancestry test. He literally just did it because he got it as a gift, and he thought all he was getting as a pie chart was a pie chart. So somebody who is, you would think, the most invested, right, in maybe like keeping things as they are, right, and not opening up that box, even he didn't really know what he was getting into. Not to say that I don't think would view this as a negative experience. I just think that probably if he had known beforehand, he would have said, boy, that sounds complicated. Let me keep the lid shut for a little while, right? So, I mean, I think it's a perfect example of something that, even Bennett Greenspan, like, didn't envision that it would become what it would become. I mean, he told me stories about trying to persuade people to buy his kit at genealogy conferences, and it being very difficult. People didn't see the use. So he saw it as the product for one particular thing. And then it's transformed into something that, that now is reconfiguring our culture. It's reconfiguring our culture one family at a time, because all of a sudden you have, in family after family across America, people saying, hey, how come you never told me I was donor conceived? Hey, what do you mean this man who raised me is not my biological father? Mom, did you have a relationship outside the marriage? These are really difficult conversations that people are having by the millions right now across America, right? And it's forcing some very difficult and clarifying, I guess I would say, reckonings about, about the past and the present, which I don't think many people could have foreseen.
It's fascinating to consider the implications for those who have not been tested. Would you say more about that?
Yeah, sure. So there's 35 million people in the databases across the 4 major companies. And the 4 majors are in descending order of size: Ancestry, which has the most, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA. Those are the 4 major recreational DNA testing companies. And so 35 million across those means that something close to 9% of the US population has tested, because not everyone in those databases is American, but the majority is, which for reasons that I talk about in the book, having to do with how we Americans see ourselves and our curiosity about the past and where we came from. So what does that mean? It means that if you haven't tested, your genetic relatives are still nevertheless there in the database waiting for you, and you'll find them if you test. And if you don't test, your genetic relatives are still there, which means that if you have we've reached basically a tipping point. If there's a genetic secret in your family, it's just a matter of time before it comes out, right? It's not a matter of if, but when. Because the databases don't need your particular DNA oftentimes to solve a mystery, even if somebody is looking for you. So I sometimes give as an example, let's say like I have a brother, and my brother conceived a child in high school and didn't know it. He was 17, he had a girlfriend, his girlfriend got pregnant, she didn't tell him. And then 30 years later, I test, and he has now an adult child who's looking for him, and his adult child tests He doesn't need to be in the database in order for her to match up with me. I'm shown as her genetic aunt, right? And so she could reach out to me, or she could just do research on me without ever contacting me and very easily figure out the identity of my brother or my multiple brothers and know it's one of them and reach out to them directly. But it doesn't need to be a sibling of that man. I could be his first cousin, and that's enough information for him to be identified by someone who's closely related to him. It could even be that I'm, a second or a third cousin to him, and that's enough information if the person is willing to do the genealogical research and go up back through the generations to find a most recent common ancestor and then come back down and do reverse genealogy. So that means that, my decision to test, even if I'm a third cousin to this man, I don't even know his name and he doesn't know mine, and we're essentially strangers to each other, my decision to test impacts him. And that means that whether or not you test, you can't opt out of this technology, right? We're all affected by it, and implicated by it. And I think that that's important to think about when you're thinking about, the importance of this technology, is that it impacts all of us. And I think the other facet that's really important about DNA testing is that I think it is interesting to even those of us who haven't tested, because it asks it kind of forces us to ask these essential human questions we've always wondered about. These questions of, like, what makes a father, right? Is father genetics? Is father the man who raised you and held you and, comforted you in the middle of the night? Can you make room in your heart for both? Should you? Right? Should you also call the man who contributed half your genetic material your father? Like, and if not, what do you call him? And those questions also apply to questions of ethnicity, right? And Alice, and many of the other people I interview for the book, wrestles with this question of, is she Jewish? Does she claim Jewishness? What does that mean to her? Jerry wrestles with it, her sister. There's 7 siblings. And what very interesting to me was to ask as many of those siblings as I could, what does this mean to you in terms of your ethnic and religious identity? Because I thought, how will they all answer this? And they all answered it a little bit different. Jerry and Alice answered it similarly, but every person has a different answer. There's a question with a 7-sided answer. And I think that we should pay attention to that, because it is not, it is important to realize that every person has to answer that question themselves for their own reasons. People's answers are going to be different, right? In terms of, like, what does this mean to me? We have to honor that.
When I first took ancestry DNA, you write about this in your book, but there was like a Scandinavian problem with the first ancestry DNA tests, and I came back 88% Scandinavian, and to my knowledge, I had no Scandinavian ancestry. So that was a bit of a shock to me. I mean, I automatically thought it was wrong, but I mean, you start thinking, what are the other possibilities?
Yeah.
So I had a little bit of an experience with that initial shock. So how do you think people generally react, like both the seeker who pursued the information and the family member who did not pursue the information, in terms of like non-paternity events, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So when you test, there's often more than one little kind of cautionary, statement that you see before you unlock your information, that says something along the lines of, you may discover unexpected relatives, or you may find that things in your family are not what you assumed, or this may change how you see the world, or how you view your family. And what I found is that over and over, when I talk to people, people don't pay attention to that warning, just as I did not pay attention to that warning, because by the time you get to it, you assume, unless you're going in with a question, unless you're like, I'm looking for the identity of my birth mother, you generally assume you know what there is to know about your family. And it is such a bizarre kind of, you'd have to twist your imagination into such a weird pretzel shape to, before, in the absence of any data to the contrary, for you to make the assumption that there's something about your own, like, genetic origins that you don't know about, right? It's a cognitive leap most of us are not going to make. So that carries over then to the reaction, which is often the initial reaction is often Alice's reaction, which is like, this is, denial. And people will call up 23andMe or Ancestry and they'll say, you guys must have switched the vial, or you guys messed up. And there's, at the companies, there's like an escalated call line now that they've had to put in place. That's like, they send the sensitive inquiries to the experts at the top, because those people are the ones who are going to explain to you why it says you have a half sister and you don't know about that half sister, and it's not because they switched the vial, right? But that's enough of a common reaction. There's a growing, small but still growing network of psychologists who are starting to specialize in this phenomenon. And every one of these psychologists has been drawn, that I've interviewed or know about, has been drawn to this field because they had their own DNA surprise experience themselves. Okay. And so one of them, I've interviewed many of them, and one of them kind of like walked me through the shape of the response, right? So it can be, after that denial, it can be anger, and then guilt over the anger. So anger may be at your mother, say, for instance, for not telling you this key bit of information, and then guilt about it. She also described anxiety, kind of like anxiety at the loss of identity, kind of like an existential anxiety, right? Like, who am I? And also a kind of a bittersweet quality. So she talked about meeting cousins that she wished she had met long before. And if only she had known, she could have forged relationships with them. And so the meeting them was sweet, but the sense of loss at not having been able to forge relationships and memories with them over the years was really strong. So it's that combination. And over and over, I've seen people describe a sense of going back and remembering memories from childhood, maybe things that their subconscious suddenly threw back at them that they hadn't thought about in years, and those memories making sense, or reinterpreting those memories in light of this new information. So it's almost like you go through and you annotate your life, right? You put an asterisk next to everything and you say, wait a minute, this throws this into a different light. So that's an interesting phenomenon. And then a sense of often of rootlessness, and a desire to be rooted, a desire to kind of orient oneself, whether that means finding out information about one's genetic kin or actually making contact. That seems to be often a strong reaction. For the people on the other side, it's complicated. And I've seen cases where one man in my book deletes his kit because he doesn't want to have a relationship with his genetic daughter. Another man has his lawyer send a letter that is titled Discontinuance of Contact, meaning stop reaching out to me. One set of siblings says we don't believe the science, even though they're clearly shown as matching as half siblings with the woman who's reached out to them. And it depends, for instance, sometimes there's the secret keepers in the older generation kind of already know. And depending on if their secret is rooted in some shame or taboo or stigma, that can be difficult to break. Sometimes that generation, whether they knew or not, there can be some guilt. Sometimes half siblings who are suddenly confronted by the revelation of another sibling are threatened by it because of what it implies about their parents, or sort of sacred narratives that they have about their family that are suddenly thrown into, disarray. Or they can just feel violated, like the boundaries of their lives are being violated by a stranger. And this person seems more like a stranger than they do like family, right? They're abruptly coming in. And so you often will see, questions like, what do you want? Are you looking for money? And I haven't seen the people I describe as seekers, who are the people who are looking for genetic kin and often finding information about themselves and then seeking. I haven't seen an instance where someone was looking for money. But that is so often the response on the part of the other side, that you can see that there's a fear there, and a kind of a sense of the fear of the stranger coming in abruptly into your life, right? Maybe it changes the birth order of the kids, and maybe that feels threatening. The oldest is suddenly not the oldest anymore. And sometimes there's a wonderful embrace. Sometimes there's a gorgeous kind of open-heartedness. but it's never not complicated, and it's never like this simple happy ending and everyone goes off into the sunset together. It's nuanced, and it's filled with this kind of dance. My timeline may not be your timeline. My desire for contact may be something that you're digging in your heels and saying, hold up, let's wait a few months and email some more. I'm not ready for that, right? So there's this very careful maneuvering that has to take place on both sides.
One of the things that struck me were there were at least a couple of relationships that people thought they were related and they ended up not being related. And I know that happened with Alice and her Irish cousin, and then Roberta Estes and
Yeah.
her brother, I believe it was.
Yeah.
I thought that was, did you run into many cases of that where people really formed these great connections? They made the wrong, link and then formed these great.
Yeah. Yes. And, and Roberta's story is interesting, and you can actually look it up because if people, want to read it, it was excerpted in the Washington Post. And her last name is Estes. And so if you look up my name and Roberta Estes, you can read her story, because it's an interesting one, where genealogy gives her brother, and then DNA, I wouldn't say takes him away, because she never allows him to be taken away, but DNA establishes they're not biologically related. And I saw different reactions to that. So there's in her case, she was so bonded with her brother that there was never a question, but that the biology did not matter, right? Too much had been shared by them, too much love and too much experience and too much hardship for her to let go of him because of a stupid, silly thing like biology. And on the other hand, I also tell a story in the book about a man named Jason who finds the man he thinks is his father, and forges a lengthy relationship with him. And for 12 years, they are assuming that they are a father and child unit. But the difference is that Jason's father keeps him at arm's length. He won't tell his adult children, for instance, that Jason exists, that they have a half brother. And they only see each other once or twice a year, and they go golfing together. And Jason is eventually so sort of dissatisfied by this arm's length relationship that he decides to do a DNA test just so that he can take the data to his father and say, look, you can really claim me. We really are related. Please let me in. Stop making me feel like a shameful secret, which is what this arm's length relationship is doing to me. And when he does the test, it turns out the man is not his genetic father. And by the way, he had been given this man's name by his mother. So that's why he thought the man was his father. And he finds someone else who actually welcomes him in. So, for Jason, he doesn't really keep in touch with that man. And you can kind of see why. The man was never kind of wholehearted in his, embrace. And so it's much, much easier for him to kind of cut ties with this man who was temporarily his dad, but really never was. And they never had a father-child relationship, father-adult-child relationship to begin with. So that ends. The particular shape of these stories are so individual, right? I mean, how they play out, that it's sometimes hard to say, like, here's a hard and fast rule, because so much depends on the intricacies of how people treat one another.
So we're now at the tipping point that you spoke of earlier, and we've already seen some dramatic implications for solving cold case murders, the Golden State Killer, for example. Is it fair for DNA test results that were obtained to illuminate family history to be used to solve crime?
So interesting. So, one of the people I write about a good deal in the book is CeCe Moore. And I know you've taken a class with her. And I think that you mentioned there was someone else on this call who's also taken a class with CeCe Moore. And I know a lot of people here probably know who she is. And I first started talking to CeCe in 2017. She was involved with the Collins family and Alice's story, and told me about it. And then I kind of watched and continued talking to her as I saw her moving into investigative genetic genealogy, which is the term that she uses to, and a lot of other people use to describe this use of genetic genealogy techniques in, in the law enforcement context. And it all came out of the Golden State Killer case, which was a case that a woman named Barbara Ray Venter worked on. She was a search angel for adoptees, and she was using techniques that had already been used for on behalf of adoptees to find their birth families, because they could not get around the lack of access to their original birth certificates in many states, right? And so they figured out how to do it with DNA, and then she applied those services to help catch the Golden State Killer, who was convicted this summer. And he is convicted. He's believed to have committed at least 13 homicides and over 50 rapes, and he was found guilty of those 13 homicides. So, in the beginning, that was the sort of the big outcry within the genetic genealogy world and elsewhere too, but particularly among genetic genealogists, was this idea of feeling somewhat violated, that they had not agreed to have their information used in this way when they had uploaded their information to this third-party website called GEDmatch. And I should say that, this law enforcement access is primarily to GEDmatch, and also this smallest DNA testing company, the private company, Family Tree DNA, but it's not at the three biggest ones. The Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage are not currently allowing law enforcement in to, upload a crime scene sample and then search for relatives among the results. And so that outcry in the beginning was really about this idea that, we put our DNA into GEDmatch to do family history research, and how dare you go in there and surreptitiously use it in this way without warning us. And then GEDmatch wound up putting in basically an opt-in agreement, and Family Tree has something similar too, like an opt-out. So now I think the debate revolves more around questions of law and privacy more generally, and it hasn't really been tested in a court. It's been used to convict. I should say, it's used as a kind of a tool to point law enforcement in a particular direction, and they have to do a legal process of matching like a crime scene sample with, like, say, a tissue that the suspect drops, but it gets them to the suspect, and then they have to confirm it with testing that's legally admissible. But it hasn't been this technique as a means of generating a tip to a person of interest, hasn't really been tested in a court of law. So you'll see that there are like legal experts who'll say this is really a violation of the Fourth Amendment, because this is really prompting a fishing expedition for someone who would never otherwise be caught. And then, of course, law enforcement will say, exactly, that's right. We would never otherwise have caught this person because they were never on our list of suspects. So, it's interesting. I don't know if that approach is going to be successful if it ever gets to a place where it's tested. But I have seen that American response in terms of polling seems to be in favor of this kind of law enforcement use, as long as it's used in the most egregious cases like homicides and sexual assaults.
We're getting close to time here, but I did want to ask, since we do have a number of people who haven't tested yet, what advice you might have for people who are thinking about taking a DNA test?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I have tested, and I have to say it's really enhanced my understanding of my family. And even people who, had a DNA result that really changed their perspective, and even in cases when it was quite painful, have told me that they're nevertheless glad to know. And I think that's because we place such a high premium on transparency and understanding of where we come from, right? And that's not always true of people on the other side, or people who are kind of caught in the middle, who realize that their test has unearthed something that maybe now they're forced to be the go-between, or they have to inform someone and act as a kind of a bioethicist. They're not sure what to do. These can be really difficult situations. So, I would say that's important to consider going in, but I also think, goodness, I mean, the immediacy of the past, the access that you get through DNA testing is absolutely extraordinary. And I've been blown away by that, right? So it's a bit of a difficult call to make without going into it, because you kind of don't know what you're going to get. You could just get something that really helps you do your family history research. And for a minority of people, you're going to get something much more weighty, which you may or may not be happy about. It's like, it's like a box, and you opening a present, you have no idea what you're going to find. I think that the advice that I like to think about, like the way that I like to reframe that question in a way is in a way, maybe it's advice for the people who are in possession of a genetic secret, right? About maybe someone in the younger generation. For instance, if you're a parent and maybe you're in your 80s and maybe you know, for whatever reason, your child doesn't know the truth about their genetic origins. Maybe you used assisted reproduction and you used, donated sperm, and your child doesn't know. And that made perfect sense when that child was conceived because of the mores and the culture at the time. But now it's changed. The advice I would give is to think about whether that's something that now you need to pass on that information, because I think it's much better for people. They usually seem to do better from what people have told me when they find this out from the lips of someone that they love, rather than if they're finding out from a computer screen. And I will say that this is enough now of an issue with millions of people affected, that there are people who will hold your hand and help you through this, right? They'll help you figure out how to say this. And I'm happy to talk about that more. But I would say, yeah, the advice is for the people who are in possession of those secrets.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I was wondering, Jerry, did you want to say anything? You don't have to, but I just thought since you're here, if you wanted to say anything about your experiences. If not, that's fine. I think you'd have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Well, I would urge anybody who hasn't tested, who has a family secret, to go ahead and get tested, just like Libby said, because it's going to come out. It is going to come out, and then the people that are left behind are they may not figure out the right answer either. Especially if you're talking about a donor conceived. I think that's preferable over, mom messed around or grandma messed around, because that will be what people think. So I would definitely do that. I had a question for Libby. I thought she talked about the 23andMe, and then it would also be what, Ancestry, and I can't remember the other company that don't allow law enforcement to download a sample. Realistically, can they stop them? I mean, I know they can stop them from using it in court, but realistically, is there any way for them to stop someone from putting this? I guess if it's spit, that well, the question stands: is there
Yeah.
any way to really stop some law enforcement from doing that?
Well, it's they can't prevent, so 23andMe, for instance, can't prevent you from downloading your information and uploading it to GEDmatch, but they can say to law enforcement, you are not permitted to come in and upload a crime scene sample, and then use that to find a second cousin through which you will discover the identity of this individual. Yeah.
Okay. You answered my question.
Can I just read Susan's comment? Is that okay?
Yes.
It says, I tested 2 years ago and found out I was donor conceived. My parents had no idea. The doctor never revealed he was fortifying my dad's samples to ensure his success. That's a absolutely really wild story. And I've heard variations on this. There is, first of all, you should know that practices by fertility doctors were really different back in the day. And there was this thing called mixing, which Susan may already know about, which is where they would mix the donor with the sperm of the dad, right? The dad who was trying to conceive a child, they would mix it with donor sperm. And sometimes they would tell the parents they were mixing it as a kind of a helping technique to help the sperm along. And it would give the parents the kind of ability to, like, say, they would never know for sure. And it was considered important to the bonding of the child and the father who was raising the child, that they should both believe that they were biologically related. So it was considered better not to know. And it gave the parents, I guess, the ability to plausibly say, yes, this is the genetic father of the child. There's also separately a growing acknowledgement of what's now being called fertility fraud, which is where doctors would substitute in their own sperm in place of an anonymous donor who might have been assumed to be somebody else. And so the doctor who's treating the patient is also the father of that patient's baby, which is really ethically fraught. And doctors were not telling their patients that they were using their own sperm, and there's no laws against it. And it doesn't happen as much now because there's frozen sperm is what's used. This is going back to the days 70s and earlier, and maybe some in the 80s when there was a tendency to use fresh sperm, but there was no laws against it. And now you're seeing in some states, a handful of states are passing what are called fertility fraud laws to make that a crime, so that can happen anymore. But Susan, thank you for sharing that story. And that's I can only imagine. I can't imagine what it's like to go through that. That's a really striking story.
One of the questions in the box is, what is the Scandinavian problem that I mentioned? It was when Ancestry first started doing DNA testing, a lot of people came back with high percentages of Scandinavian ancestry, and they didn't believe they did. And a few months later, they did some kind of adjustment to how they found, how they figured out ethnicities, and it was adjusted. And then mine personally came back to more what I thought it was going to be. So it's not a problem anymore.
Susan followed up by saying, we've also recently learned that the same doctor was using samples from patients who are not donors and had not given permission for using on other patients. And I've heard this from a couple of men who've reached out to me to tell me that they, for instance, one man told me he was having difficulty conceiving and has discovered all these years later that the sperm that he donated to help his wife conceive was used to help another child in another family be created. So, I mean, somebody needs to do a book. Maybe it exists. There's some books, I don't know if they get into this, on sort of the Wild West atmosphere of the fertility industry. But I don't know if people know this, but there's no regulations on the number of children that one donor can help conceive. And so there are some situations where there's between 100 and 200 half siblings from the same donor. Yeah, no regulation.
Wow.
Yes, I spoke to a man that when we were doing our family search, and he was his father was a sperm donor, and his father, I guess it was a pretty famous case. He was Jewish, and depending on what the couple wanted in their genetic profile, his sperm became. And he told me, the guy I spoke to, the son of this doctor, said that there were many people that were upset because they didn't order the kosher meal. And they were very upset to discover that their, Aryan donor was actually a European Jew.
Wow.
It looks
amazing.
Like, yeah. It looks like we have another comment that someone found out that her dad wasn't her biological father, and that her husband tested and found out his dad was also not his bio dad. And that now she has 3 new brothers that they love each other, and some good came out of it.
Wow.
Obviously, yeah. And that she doesn't regret taking the test and finding out the truth.
Wow.
An incredible story.
Wow. And I just responded, and I responded, it's a beautiful and moving story. I meant to say that to Judy. I apologize. I wrote to Susan because I got my names mixed up. Both stories are incredible. Thank you for sharing them. Yeah, I mean, I think, again, as I said, I heard this over and over. We want to know who we are. And it's important to be cautious about the degree to which we place undue weight on our genes in terms of, believing that they're going to predict our future or they're a blueprint for who you are. I mean, we know that that's not true. We know that, we're the result of a complex combination of genes and environment, right? And we know that when it comes to disease, and we know that when it comes to just sort of how we grow up and become the people we are. So there's always a danger, and I write about this in the book, like our kind of human tendency to read too much into the genes or to be too essentialist in our thinking about genes, and particularly about race and difference and things like that. But at the same time, it's not nothing. It's a lot. And you can't help but be reoriented by a revelation that, along the lines of half of your genes are from a stranger, right? Or half of your genes are not what they thought, and now you have to understand why and go back 100 years to the beginnings of it. So I think we can't talk enough about this. I mean, maybe I'm biased, but we're at this point in time when our present culture is colliding with the past. And in the past, we were different about things. We didn't talk about certain things. Now we have this culture of transparency. Everyone's telling their own story, and we're really learning how different things were 67 years ago, and having to have a kind of moment of reckoning. I think of it as like, this is the age of genetic reckoning, right? And it's not happening gradually. It's happening all of a sudden in family after family because of DNA testing. DNA testing is pushing this issue onto the front plate of many, many families and many, many individuals.
I think it's such an important book. And I think I said, earlier, I loved it. I'm so glad I read it. As you get involved in DNA testing, you think of some of these issues, but, to have it in writing like this and so well written is just wonderful. I'm so glad that you wrote this book.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're
And
welcome.
I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with somebody who is a search angel.
Yeah.
And knows these issues from the inside.
Yeah, some of you might know that I volunteer for searchangels.org. So, I love it. My personal feeling is that adoptees have the right to know who their birth families are, and that's why I do it. But I also love it because I like being a detective and I love genealogy research. So if I can put those skills to work, it's good for me too. It looks like we're out of time, unless anyone else has any final questions. Let me just check chat really quick. Were health issues the reason some families were wanting genetic testing? Most companies that were discussed don't do health testing. 23andMe does do health testing. So that's kind of, I don't know, a bit separate. I think
they all do now, actually.
But they all do? Okay.
Yeah, they all do now, but Ancestry has really driven the market for a very long time, right? Even in 23andMe's case, which is, the one company that like historically has always offered health testing. Mm-hmm. It's the ancestry piece, that the family history research piece, that has driven their bulk of their sales, from what I was able to tell. There's been a slowdown the last, say, year, I think, and you see them pivoting now towards health related results, but they bundle them together. So there are going to be people who are going to test for health related reasons, or have been historically, and there are going to be, I think, more so now as the offerings get more robust and more reliable, and as the recreational DNA testing industry moves closer to relationships with doctors and physician networks that support them. I think we're going to see more of that. But also, I think it's important to realize that at the moment, at least, if you test for health related reasons, you get ancestry results too. And that means that if you look, you maybe find something you didn't expect. So it's just not an issue. It's going to go away. The databases are going to continue to get bigger.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We loved having you. And for all of you who attend, I'm going to send you a link to the recording. And I have some information on how you can get signed and personalized copies of The Lost Family from Libby, and I'll send that via email too. So thank you all very much for coming. It was lovely having you, Libby, and Jerry too. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I was thrilled to be talking to you, Rhonda, and Jerry. Always so happy to see you. So thank you very
Nice
much.
to see you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.